Well, I'm glad you've stuck around this long to continue to be in a Connect group here at Connection Point Church. This week we continue our study on the book Didn't See It Coming. We continue to look at the 7 obstacles that Carey Nieuwhof thinks that most of us have to try to overcome, and there are things that we didn't see coming. We've talked about several issues, and this one this week is one that we've probably all dealt with. It's the issue of pride. In fact, I left my Notre Dame sweatshirt on to show that I'm willing to swallow my pride since they lost to Michigan last week. But here's the other reality for us. Sometimes pride we see really easily in other people, but it's really difficult to see in ourselves. The reality for us is we know people all the time who are too proud to ask for help. We think of the husband who won't stop and ask for directions. We think of people who are too proud to change their ways, even if what they're doing is not working. We think of people who are always trying to one-up others, who are always telling the stories about what they've done or the vacations they have gone on, but they never think to ask you what you did or what's going on in your life. It's a one-sided relationship. And so Carey tells this story that kind of makes me laugh. At the beginning of this chapter, he talks about one time when he had made this commitment that for 1 year, he wouldn't purchase anything beyond food. He wouldn't buy new clothes, he wouldn't buy electronics, all the stuff that he liked to purchase, he wouldn't, because he recognized that sometimes he wasn't just consuming stuff, his stuff was consuming him. And so he tells a story that he's on his way to a meeting, and on the way to the meeting, he spills his tea, and it goes all over his lap, and he doesn't know what to do, and he happens to see a Walmart, and he pulls in and he thinks, well, if I just buy a cheap pair of pants, that doesn't really count as purchasing something, right? Like, that's not really real. I'm going to a meeting. It matters. And he began to recognize something that was welling up inside him, something that he was struggling with. It was his own pride. His pride about his appearance and what other people might think about him. And he didn't want to have to answer the question, why do you have a stain right in the crotch of your pants? And so instead, Carey walks in the store, and as he walks in, he's convicted. And so instead, he takes a beeline to the restroom, and he splashes water all over his pants and tries to make it a little bit better. And then, as if that wasn't enough to humiliate him, he had to dry those same pants, and so there he was using the hand dryer at this Walmart, and it just happened to be in view of many of the people checking out. So he was reminded of this kind of self-reflection of his own pride. And so he began thinking about this, that pride isn't just something that we think about in other people, it's something that's probably true for us. We could talk about narcissists, and there's a whole other issue there, and if that truly is you really do need help. And I don't say that jokingly, but you need lots and lots of help, because it's something that we want to overcome for all of us if we become the center of our own universe. And here's the reality. So he shares these words in his book, and it has just resonated in my life because I read these words for the first time, and I just had to write beside them, wow, I think that's me too often. And here's what he wrote. I was afraid people would judge me or think less of me. I didn't have the humility to risk being misunderstood, judged, or seen as uncool, not even for an hour until I was able to get back home. Pride runs so deep. It's one of the cardinal sins against God. Pride made me believe these things. What other people think matters more than what God thinks. His love for me is not enough. His approval of me is inadequate unless I have the approval of others. Appearances count for a lot. I am what others think I am. Deep down, the experience revealed that I think I'm not enough, that my clothes have to make a statement about me, because I'm not capable of making a statement on my own. I gotta be honest with you that after I read that the first time, in the little margins, whoa, too often, that's me. And I don't know where pride manifests itself in your life, but I'll guarantee it does. And one of the things that we think about is, well, I don't spend most of my day thinking about how awesome I am. But the truth is, pride manifests itself in other ways. Sometimes we spend most of the day thinking how not awesome I am, thinking about our shortcomings. And the truth is, our insecurity can be just as significant to our pride, because pride really is obsession with self. And if we're obsessed with ourself, whether it's in our insecurity or in our abundance of confidence, either way, if we're centered on self, that's where pride creeps in. In fact, I wrote these words a couple weeks ago. In a world full of people wrestling with our identities, these words of Brennan Manning are no less true today. Here's his quote. My identity as Abba's child is not an abstraction or a tap dance into religiosity. It's the core truth of my existence. Here were my words added on. If only we recognize God's great love for each of us. What if we recognize there's nothing greater than being God's beloved child? If we embrace that as true, we might find we would wrestle much less with our identity because we know who we are God's son, or God's daughter. See, identity is one of those things that we wrestle with, and our pride comes out in it because either we are so focused on self because we think we're great, or we're so focused on self because we think we're not. And so our insecurity can drive us. And so here's some signs that insecurity is driving our pride. One, you compare yourself to others. And so I came across these words in Carey's book where he says this: you don't have lots to learn from other people, but insecure people aren't driven so much by a desire to learn as they are by the desire to know whether they are better or worse than others. There's a world of difference between tracking with others to grow, learn, empathize, or celebrate versus tracking with others to see how you stack up. One is fundamentally healthy, the other destructive. There's a lot of sin involved with comparison. Want to see how twisted this is? Sure, maybe you don't feel great about yourself, but you tell yourself as a source of comfort that at least you're not as bad off as some other people. So pride compels you to pick out people to convince yourself you're superior. You may not have your dream body, but at least you're not as heavy as that certain coworker. You're now a PhD, but gosh, you're smarter than most of the people in your class. You're not driving a BMW, but your car isn't as dented and scratched as your brother-in-law's. You select people who in your mind assure you that you're brighter, richer, faster, or more attractive. One of my counselors has a great name for this: comparigance. It's the arrogance born of comparison. I don't know about you, but I find myself, I've been there way too often in my life, and you probably have too. So the second way that insecurity drives our pride is our self-worth is determined by our performance, our latest performance. So if I did really good at work today, then I'm really good. If I did really bad at work today, then I'm really bad. And so whatever it is we find, we put ourselves in that space, and it determines what our value actually is. The third way is you can't celebrate someone else's success. When you hear of their success, rather than being excited for them, you think in your mind, I wish they hadn't done so well so I would look better. The fourth way, you squeeze gifted people out of your life. In other words, maybe you're surrounded with really talented people, but because of their talent, it makes you feel more insecure. And so if you and I feel more insecure with really gifted people around us, that's usually a sign of our insecurity, not their good qualities. Number 5, you want to say in everything. Here's the reality for many of us. If we think our opinion needs to be heard in every which way, in every kind of situation, then we're probably just insecure. The reality isn't that we're not smart. Most of us are experts in maybe at most 1, 2, or 3 things if we're incredible. And if you think you're an expert in everything, I can guarantee you you're not. And so here's the reality for us, is that pride can lead us to the place where our heart is hard. Most of us want to be described in pretty cool ways. And so there's this passage in 1 Samuel chapter 13, which Samuel, the prophet, is talking to Saul, the king, and he says these words: "But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." I mean, can you imagine being described by that line? The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people. And that man was David, and David became king, and David was kind of like my hero of the Old Testament. I just loved his story. I mean, he killed Goliath and a lion and a bear. I mean, he just seemed to be this guy who had it all together. He had a heart after God. He wrote many of the Psalms. He could play the harp, which is, I guess, like the guitar. I mean, he just was really a cool guy. But then, the more I read of David's life when he grew older, you begin to see where pride began to creep in and the impact it had on his life. And so this passage in 2 Samuel chapter 11, the first verse, it says, when kings should have been off at war, and David wasn't. David, he'd done everything. He'd proved everything. And so 2 Samuel, the author records these words. He says, one evening David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now, I got to be honest with you, that story's pretty bad. I mean, you can't imagine her being able to say no to the king. That's a pretty tough ask of any woman to say no to her king, because he could have her put to death. He knows she's someone else's wife. In fact, her husband is off at war for him. And this is the reality. David, if you read the rest of the story, and you probably already know it, David ends up basically murdering her husband because his pride got in the way. His pride got in the way. He couldn't allow himself to get caught. He couldn't allow himself to be seen for who he was, an adulterer. He couldn't allow himself to do that because his pride told him that he was better than that he deserved that that it wasn't his fault, that he could do what he wanted because he was the king. And so this is the reality, is that David at one point was a man after God's own heart, but now he found himself far from God. See, we can choose a heart after God, or we can choose a heart that is hard. It's a continual choice. It's not a choice we make one time, it's a choice we make every single day. And so here's some characteristics of a hard heart: that we're superior. In other words, I'm better than so-and-so. I'm better than them. I act better than that. We can be judgmental. This line I love about Christians is that Christians are self-righteous. They don't do drugs, they just do food. I'll just leave that right there, and you can wrestle with that if that's true for you. Number 3, we find ourselves unaccountable. We're not accountable to anyone. We justify it in some way. We don't allow anyone else to help hold us accountable for the life that we live. Number 4, we're isolated. We don't have true friendships. We're not really close with people. We just live a life solitary in some ways, and not because we have great friends and they're just not around. It's because we find if we're isolated, then it's my own pride. I can choose how I live, and no one can speak into that. So how do we make sure we don't end up having a story told about us, or telling a story that we don't want to describe us? How do we do that? The only way to overcome pride is with humility. And we know the model of Jesus shows humility in its purest form, but there's some other ways we can think about humility. And so how do we cultivate humility? Well, the first way is we could do it when we're young. We could decide as a young child, I want to be humble, and just seek to cultivate that in life. But most of us don't choose that path. The second way that we become humble is we begin to be humiliated. And we've all probably been there, and you could tell your horror stories of being humiliated. But the reality is humiliation only lasts for a season. It only lasts for a moment. Because often once we've been humiliated, once that's over and we've kind of recovered from it to some degree, we move on. It doesn't really shape us into the future. It becomes something that maybe even we guard against. And so we allow our pride to put up different kinds of walls. The third way, probably the most effective way, is we invite humility and we cultivate humility. Because humility doesn't look all that attractive, or it looks attractive in others, but in the moment for us, it doesn't look that attractive as ways and we're called to live. And so here's some ways we can cultivate a life of humility. We can never lose gratitude. We can be really grateful people. Second way, we can take the low place. We can be the servant of servants. We can find ourselves recognizing that nothing is beneath us. Third way, we can open our notebook. We can begin to learn from other people ways of living. We can ask really good questions and learn to become great listeners and people who really do listen to other people and learn from them. Fourth way, we can push other people into the spotlight. Make it not about us by celebrating others and putting them up at the forefront, and then watching them get the glory that we don't necessarily have to have. The next way, and this is probably the hardest one for us, is get ridiculously honest with ourselves and with God. Because for most of us, that's a pretty hard thing to do. So these words from James, I think, are helpful as we think about what it would look like to live a life of humility. James records these words in James chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. And so I would challenge you to listen to them now and then read them again later. So here's what James writes, chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. And righteousness, as we've talked about before, is just this idea that I am in right relationship with God. So we sow with peace, we find we're in right relationship with God. And when we live as James talks about here in this kind of way, we'll find that there's a wisdom that comes. And in that wisdom, we find humility as a way that we're called to live. And so then Carrie asked a couple questions that I think might be good to end our time with today. What do you and I need to confess? What is it that we need to be really honest about with ourselves and with God? What is it that we're holding on to that if we really kind of rip our life open and look honestly at what's going on, that we should say, you know what, here's an area of pride in my life and I just have to confess it and be willing to change it. And this second thing is this: what describes you or I that we wish didn't? What's the characteristic or the thing or the thought, whether it's our insecurity or our confidence is off the charts, which borders on narcissism? whichever it is that describes us, this obsession of self, whatever it is that we wish didn't describe us, is probably an area of pride. And the truth is, God can't change us until we're willing to recognize we need to change. And our family and friends, they already know the areas that we need to change. We just often don't want to hear it. And so the challenge for us is to become the kind of people who maybe we didn't see pride being an issue in our life, but we're willing to seek after humility so that pride doesn't have to define our future. Hope you have a great discussion in your connection group this week.